I think all of us have those nostalgic games. You know, those games that become almost a part of who we are. No matter how old they get or how old we get, we'll revere them as some of the greatest games of all time. Maybe they hit us at the right moment in our lives or struck a chord with us personally. Or maybe it was just the type of game that we'd never really seen before. For me, there are a lot of games that fall into these categories, and believe me, I'd readily admit that the majority of them haven't held up incredibly well. In fact, I'd wager that a good amount of them just plain suck at this point. But buried way back in 2001 is a special experience, no matter how outdated it's become. A little game on the PlayStation 2 called Final Fantasy X.
Listen to my story. This may be our last chance.
Now, to be honest, this game is nostalgic for a ton of reasons. I had seriously never played an RPG at this point in my gaming career. They were just way too complex for someone who was doing his best to master Super Mario 64, Tetris, and The Legend of Zelda. No, the whole idea of stats, orbs, magic, who was I kidding? I could barely summarize the various applications of basic physics showing both the gravitational and electrical force between two objects is proportional to the inverse of the distance between them squared, save for quantum fluctuations that could slightly alter a force's dependence on distance, in turn affecting the strong nuclear force in often dramatic ways. I could barely do that. How was I supposed to figure this out? What? What even is this? Yeah, it was way over my head. But that's where my older brother stepped in. Look at him, isn't he? I'm cuter. I'm more adorable. I remember coming home every day after school, running downstairs to where we kept the PlayStation 2, and watching him play Final Fantasy X until our parents had to pry us away from the television screen so we didn't miss dinner that night. Screw tacos, Mom! We were kind of in the middle of something. Oh yeah, what was it? Saving the land of Spira! But anyway, let's go ahead and dive in. Final Fantasy X arrived in North America on December 17, 2001, and was directed and planned by a handful of Square Enix veterans eager to test their mettle on the new PlayStation 2 console. It's the story of Titus. Titus? You serious? It's pronounced Titus? Whatever, I'm calling him Titus. A star blitzball player who lives in the city known as Zanarkand, which sounds so badass that I assume that's where every rock legend ends up at some point in their career. The metropolis and its citizens are eventually attacked by an enormous monster known as Sin, which essentially warps Titus and his mentor Auron, who is the most badass character in the history of the universe, to the world of Spira, where monster encounters will give you a heart attack, and violently hitting machines is a viable option to actually operating them. And while the game starts off relatively slow after this point, seriously, like nothing happens here. Look, nothing. This is all nothing. You kinda need to know it, but not really. The plot eventually evens itself out over time, becoming fairly easy to follow despite the absolutely insane amount of plot twists that just start materializing out of nowhere. They just boom, halfway through it's like, what? I can't even. To make an incredibly long story short, Final Fantasy X focuses on a sacred pilgrimage made by summoners to gain power at various temples in order to defeat Sin. Yeah, that thing. Along with their guardians, summoners don't actually kill Sin, they just kind of, knock him out for a bit before he comes back years later. Throughout your journey, you learn little tidbits like this, things that make this world feel real. It has rules and traditions, like the fact that belt buckles aren't a suggestion, they're a f***ing requirement. And in the end, there's a lot of symbolism here, with some pretty obvious allusions to Christianity and the world influenced heavily by Asian culture. And hey, that was pretty new for a Final Fantasy game, right? But you'll have to trudge through some pretty horrible dialogue and voice acting early on if you ever hope to make it to the good parts.
Is Zanarkand like this too?
Well, there are more buildings, all tall ones, and cramped together.
Oh. They must be so tall. Don't you ever get dizzy?
Speaking of which, Final Fantasy X was actually the first game in the franchise to introduce fully voiced characters, which, that was a pretty big deal at the time. But despite the fact that the characters sound relatively fine from a technical standpoint, it's their animation coupled with that awful script that makes everything feel janky and really awkward by today's standards. Seriously, I don't even have to make a joke here. Look at this.
No, that's ridiculous! No way! I don't believe you!
But even with all of that being said, Final Fantasy X's story is incredibly memorable. And without the need for creative exposition due to Tidus' role as a newcomer in Spira, the narrative pacing is fantastic. It's full of emotion. Action. Romance. And while I'd venture to say that the story is the primary driving force here, the actual game is just as good. Final Fantasy X is a turn-based RPG. You've got your mage, thief, tank, and a few others, and your job is to use them effectively in each battle, though you can switch them out effortlessly without wasting a turn. Which is good, because enemies tend to come with different resistances and weaknesses, requiring you to rotate who takes the front lines based on their abilities. Character upgrading is handled via a sphere grid, which is... okay, you basically gather spheres throughout your travels that can be assigned to specific nodes on a grid. Leveling characters up gives them the ability to move along this grid, and you can plot your own course to specific upgrades if you so choose. If you neglect to involve any member of your party in a battle, they won't gain experience, leaving you completely screwed if one of your main fighters happens to fall in battle. Like Yuna. Yuna is the lone summoner of your party, and throughout most of the game, she's your primary healer. So, yeah, she's basically your everything. And the best part, she's not relegated to one summon. No, you can spam that shit once you get some of the higher level guys. Like a Sparky horse. Or, that's just a straight up Dragon of Death, I don't know what else to tell you. Each character also has access to an overdrive, basically this game's version of limit breaks. Take or dish out enough damage and you can pull off a powerful attack provided you complete a small QuickTime event. Because doing lots of flips before cutting someone up, that's obviously much more lethal. Obviously. That's not to say that the game's easy, because it totally isn't. I mean, okay, it is for a bit, but after a certain point, bosses will actually start fighting back. And they'll f***ing destroy you. Like, without question. They will one-shot these things without lifting a goddamn finger.
You will be avenged! You will be avenged!
Now, luckily, the checkpoints do give you ample opportunity to grind for experience before a super big fight, so yeah, that's helpful. Thanks for throwing me a damn bone, Square Enix. Speaking of grinding, the game is actually fairly linear, though there are a few open areas here and there, and there's an emphasis on late game exploration. But unlike Final Fantasy XIII, the pacing is absolutely excellent. Areas aren't just full of enemies, but also NPCs offering items, skills, and information about the world, which is cool. It wasn't like they were shoving me down hallways, forcing me to fight dozens of monsters before watching a cutscene and making me do the same damn thing over and over again for 20 hours, sorry. I really hate that game. Now, there are a few side activities, like Blitzball, which is, well, it sucks. Okay, it sucks. It just sucks. It's a tactical game involving competing stats with the opposing team, and you're essentially forced to learn its ins and outs due to a tournament Tidus takes part in early in the game. There are some clever sequences here and there so the pacing doesn't completely flounder, but you're pretty much gonna lose the whole damn tournament anyway because the opposing team's stats are astronomically better than your own. Nothing makes me enjoy a minigame more than losing on my first attempt. You got me hooked, Final Fantasy X. You got me hooked! No. The best thing about Final Fantasy X is the idea that you're constantly growing stronger. Now that's a pretty typical trait in an RPG, but the fact that the story itself is about growing more powerful to defeat an evil whale demon. What's this thing again? That's what makes Final Fantasy X an absolute gem. You're constantly getting new weapons, new abilities, and when you aren't, you can take solace in the fact that you're probably on your way to getting another badass summon. Which leads me to these weird puzzle sections. Now, look, I'm all for breaking up the monotony, and while the earlier puzzles are fairly simplistic, the later sections are just outright stupid and really annoying. By no means horribly difficult, just super time-consuming. And each one has these different rules that never get explained, so you just run around hitting X on everything like, does this work? No. Does this work? No. Does this work? No. Does this work? No. Does this work? Yeah. Really? No! Come on, I want to get back to fighting monsters and hitting on my friends in an uncomfortable manner. If you haven't noticed by now, Final Fantasy X looks actually not too bad, save for those awkward animations. Of course, this is the HD remaster for the PlayStation 3. And no, it's not exactly a stone-cold stunner by today's standards, but back in 2001, this game looked amazing. The remastered version also received some updates to its soundtrack. What originally sounded like this now sounds like this. Look, Final Fantasy X may not be the best in the franchise, but to me, it's the most important. I had never seen a game like this before, and I guess that stems back to the old theory that your first Final Fantasy game is usually your favorite. But for me and my brother, it was more than that. It wasn't just my adventure, it was our adventure. And playing it through by myself for this video over a decade later, all of those memories just came flooding back. And I found deeper meanings within nearly every aspect of this game's design. Beating the last few bosses, I was overwhelmed with these feelings of accomplishment, and yeah, maybe it was bittersweet. But that journey, the one that my brother and I made together, that's the one that's always gonna stay with me. And I didn't even touch the controller once, but I didn't care. You see, the reason this game is so nostalgic for me is because it was not only the first deep, fleshed out narrative I'd experienced in a video game, not because I actually cared for these characters, it was because those memories with my brother are so ingrained within the game itself that it's actually become a part of who I am, part of who we are. We were in it together. And then we used a Game Shark because damn you, Unalesca, and your bullshit!